Adesso noi andiamo alla professoressa Irina Borshch, che lei non è presente, le dispiace molto. Ah, bene, sì. Buongiorno professoressa. Vorrei presentare brevemente, perché è molto interessante, perché lei va a parlare della evolution of canon law in the works of Corecco and the parallel studies of Orthodox Theologians in the United States, no? In the 16th and 17th year. La professoressa Borshch è una, lo faccio in inglese un momento, is a historian and legal thought. She is also a doctoral researcher at the Waldensen Faculty of Theology at Rome and a senior fellow in the Classical Institution Research Laboratory at the Tikhon Orthodox University Moscow. She holds a doctorate in missiology from the Pontifical Urbana University. Vuole dire, il suo dottorato in Urbaniana è stato dedicato a un confronto tra le figure di Bulgakov e Corecco. E è sempre molto interessante adesso per noi anche indagare sul ruolo della teologia ortodossa nel pensiero di Corecco. Do la parola a lei.
Grazie mille, mi permetto di cominciare in italiano. Grazie mille per avermi invitato, sono veramente molto grata a professore Lamanà e professore Ru. Prima di tutto, sono stata a Lugano 15 anni fa. Sono stata fortunata di avere come il mio Virgilio per entrare in tutti questi temi, professoressa Moretti. Sono molto lieta adesso veramente rinnovare la conoscenza con la vostra facoltà. So I would like to compare Eugenio Corecco's ideas on the historical evolution of canon law with some of the theses of Orthodox theologians in the United States of America in the 60s and 70s, such as Alexander Schmemann and John Meindorf. The Catholic canonists and the Orthodox canonists were not familiar, but their works echo similar concepts, especially with regard to the convergence of canon law and ecclesiology. And that is quite interesting and useful for understanding this historical era of church thought. The interpretation of the historical legal models which Corecco presented at the 1980s Congress of the Canon Law in Freiburg has not lost its relevance. His contribution, as well as his earlier work on synods in the USA, shows that Eugenio Corecco's theory of law was not born as an abstract reflection, but came from a deep knowledge of historical experience and understanding of the turning points in the evolution of church law. Based on the history of theology, Corecco describes 4 models of Western church law: sapiential sacramental, classical medieval, post-Tridentine public law, and post-conciliar. Each model reflects a specific stage in the development of theology and legal culture, from patristics through scholasticism and post-Tridentine apologetics to the new theology of the 20th century. The method of models of church law allows to show how the concepts of the previous model overlap with the concepts of the new one. So any reform can't abolish the previous model. The models are overlapping, emphasizing the integrity of the canonical tradition. Corecco doesn't exclude from the post-conciliar model the presence of certain aspects of previous ones, patristic, scholastic, and post-Tridentine, in its form of the School of Public Law. An important contribution of patristics to this church law was its creative efforts aimed at assimilating the classic cultural heritage of antiquity in a Christian way. This classical heritage included both philosophical thought and legal practices, texts, and methods of their interpretation. The enduring importance of the scholastic model is the actualization of Aristotelian thought about law. The contribution of the modern era to church law carried out within the framework of the post-Tridentine model is the historical and critical method, the development of general concepts of the theory of law, the technique of codification, and so on. According to Corecco, canon law preserves the experience of the church, the experience of decisions, Christian life and faith in different epochs and in different cultural circumstances. The historical experience of law is heterogeneous. It has traditions, both regional and belonging to different eras. Drawing parallels between canonical and theological concepts, Corecco refers to an essay on the history of theology by the famous Catholic liturgist Cipriano Vagaggini. Cipriano Vagaggini offered these models of theology without entering in the progressism. So nowadays, Cipriano Vagaggini is not so famous as, for example, the model of Hans Küng theology paradigm. But Küng model was developed in a progressist way, while Vagaggini doesn't show us that patristic was worse than, for example, scholasticism, because it was previous. And that is why Corecco also in this perspective do not enter in this progressist ambiguity. But his ultimate goal is to move on to a discussion of the contemporary era. Among the characteristics, features of the theological climate of the 20th century is a conscious search for proximity to patristic sources. At the same time, as Corecco showed, the flourishing of research in the field of liturgics and sacramentology put attention to the close relationship between lex vivendi and lex orandi, as it was in ancient church. However, despite the proclaimed return to the fathers or return to the sources, theology of modern times is radically different from patristics in its methodology, which stems from modern philosophy. In many aspects, contemporary theology is much closer to philosophical anthropology than to the church tradition of first millennium. According to Corecco, canonical science sometimes also too hastily applies the methods of modern humanities, social and political sciences, and this is a vulnerable spot. The overview of church law based on key points in the development of theology, which was presented by Eugenio Corecco in 70s and 80s, in the context of the reform of canon law in Catholic Church, had one of its goals to raise the question of the relationship between changeable and permanent elements in the canonical tradition. This issue was also relevant for the Orthodox Church in the 20th century, although in the context of other events than the recent Catholic legal reform. Among Orthodox theologians, Alexander Schmemann came closest to the type of such canonical systemization in his 1971 article, A Meaningful Storm, where he compared various epochs of canon law with geological strata, the norms and institutions created by different epochs on the different ideological and cultural foundations corresponding to each period still form parts of tradition, simultaneously like layers of soil and relief. The storm discussed in Schmeman's article is a heated discussion in the 1960s about the prospects of turning the Orthodox metropolis in North America into an autocephalous territorial local church. That meant overcoming divisions in Orthodoxy and American Orthodoxy into ethnic jurisdictions, strengthening synodality and uniting in the logic of American local Orthodox Church. Here we need to say some words about American Orthodoxy without entering too much in history. Orthodoxy in America has a lot of parallels with Catholic Church. In America, for example, the first Orthodox bishop in North America, Orthodox bishop, was nominated in the same decade as the first Catholic bishop in USA. So it was the last decade of, it was 1780s when it was nominated. It was the time when Alaska was Russian territory, and it was Orthodox mission there. So it was the first bishop of Alaska. When Alaska became the part of United States, all those local Orthodox dioceses so became United States Orthodox diocese. And then for a lot of time, it was very interesting structure of this diocese, because even it was the bishop who was a part of Russian Orthodox Church, the church was very multi-ethnical, as we could say, because all the migrants from the Russian, Ottoman, and also Austrian Empire, all those migrants was a part of this great North America Orthodox diocese. From one side, Orthodoxy is a little minority in the United States population, but it is a very important part of global Orthodoxy, because those diasporas had a great influence thanks to their financial and also intellectual aid for the Orthodoxy in East Europe. So in 60s and 70s years, it was the time when the project of creating the local American church, creating different ethnical jurisdiction, which crawled into different jurisdiction after the First World War, when all those empires also became different national states. Schmemann was very active in creating this local church. And he thought that if not in letter, but in meaning, this process was founded on ancient canons. But when interpreting them, he encountered other layers of canonical rules and paradigms, imperial and national. Imperial, it was the tradition of Byzantine Church and especially of Constantinople Patriarchate. The national, it was the tradition of the new Balkan churches, which was created in the 12th century. The peculiarity of the American situation was in fact that these canonical paradigms were not part of the history of the new continent of the United States and of Canada. Orthodox migrants brought these paradigms with them in the New World in their canonical consciousness. But that is why it was easier on American soil to rethink them and transform them into the new global model of universal orthodoxy, which would be based more on ecclesiological meaning. Another active participant in the process of the formation of the autocephalous church in America, theologian John Meadorff, also wrote in 1962 that the canons can only be understood in the light of theology and ecclesiology. He believed that this understanding was rare among contemporary canonists. Now, if we will back to Eugenio Corecco, from these Orthodox authors, where we find really a lot of similarities, I would say that Corecco was one of the first Catholic canonists who who thought a lot about this Orthodox tradition, as Professor Ru brilliantly told us. And I'm really very grateful to him for his pages in this theme. So he really gives us feedback here, and even if he criticizes Orthodox tradition, this critics is really very interesting and very important as a kind of feedback. At the same time, we can say that his sources also was very specific. Professor Ru told us that he mainly read Russian authors, but I would suggest that maybe he read a lot of authors of Greek tradition, and their style of self-presentation showing Orthodox Church as the church of the first millennium was very important. But as we see in Schmemann analysis here, this representation of the Orthodox Church as a church of first millennium is also have other layers as imperial and nationalistic. So it is the first millennium through the filters, through the lenses of these imperial and nationalistic traditions. And we would say that a new universal Orthodox global canonical tradition now is still in the formation. Maybe the third millennium will be the next millennium, the millennium of the formation of this tradition. And here the works of Eugenio Corecco is very important for us, because he really shows that even if canon law changed, it is always loyal to its roots, and it is always loyal to the faith of the church. Thank you very much for your attention.